Experts in South Africa have warned that South Africa may be kicked out of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a trade deal that gives African countries duty-free access to the U.S. market for over 1,800 products, in addition to the more than 5,000 products that are eligible for duty-free access under the Generalized System of Preferences program. Now, according to International Monetary Fund data, trade between the U.S. and South Africa was estimated at $23.3 billion. That's about 430 billion rand last year. Now, that compares to $850 million, just about 15.69 billion rand of exports and imports between South Africa and Russia. Now, if this happens, it could send a signal to the world that South Africa is an economic partner to be avoided. And this comes after the U.S. congressmen from both the Democratic and Republican parties urged the U.S. President Joe Biden to move the AGOA summit away from South Africa. Now, they want this to be done as a sanction against South Africa's perceived support for Russia. Now, how will this impact South Africa's import and export trade? And will the Southern African nation now bow to pressure? We're going to find out from our guest this morning, and we have Nokwanda Maseko, a senior economist, trade and industrial policy strategist, joining me to unpack this. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So now that we see that world powers, when they make these huff and puff statements, it will not be wise, or it would be wise rather, not to take this kind of threats unlightly. Now, is there a possibility that South Africa might be removed from the AGOA program? And is that threat coming as a result of its perceived affiliation or affinity or disposition, as the case may be, with Russia?
I mean, there's always the possibility that South Africa would be removed, right? Because part of the thing with AGOA is that it's not so much a trade deal as much as it is a trade concession, which essentially allows South Africa to export goods to the US duty-free. And in return, what the US hopes to get from that is a good relationship with South Africa. Because it's not a trade deal, what that means is that at any point, the US could actually revoke AGOA, or it could decide to take South Africa out of AGOA completely. And so I think that's the biggest disadvantage for South Africa. I am, however, not a foreign policy expert, and so I can't necessarily comment about whether or not this would be good for South Africa. I will say, though, that, I mean, when you look at total AGOA trade, that was about 3% of total exports for South Africa last year. And in the bigger scheme of things, is it important enough for South Africa to keep going back and forth? Because I think, as you'd remember, this is not the first time that there's been threats to remove South Africa from AGOA. There was a time, I believe it was in 2015 or 2016, where we were having troubles with potential poultry imports from the US, with the US saying that there is a possibility to take South Africa out of AGOA because we would not accept their poultry exports to the country. And so I think, as I said earlier, that is part of the big disadvantage of this program for South Africa, which is that it's not a trade deal. And so at any given point, the US can decide to kick us out. In terms of the losses, I mean, there is obviously going to be some losses for South African exporters. And so far, the biggest beneficiaries of AGOA has been the auto sector. I mean, there are other sectors that are also benefiting, but most of the benefits of that trade, of that duty-free export program is the auto sector. Would they still continue to export to the US if AGOA was taken away? Probably they would still continue exporting. I think the biggest concern there would then be that obviously they would now be doing it at a higher cost because there would be duties, and then trying to figure out what are the knock-on effects on the production processes, on employment, for example. But I think right now, if there were to be losers, I think it would be the smaller sectors like food and beverages, for example. But industries such as automotives, I think they would be completely fine. They would still be wanting to export to the US. And I mean, given how expensive it would be for them, I think it would be up to them to make the decision about whether they want to continue or not. But I mean, as a country, I do think that in terms of foreign policy and AGOA, I think it's time to reevaluate whether the costs of AGOA actually are worth the benefits that we're getting. Not to say that I am, lobbying for South Africa being taken out of AGOA, but I think it is a discussion worth having.
But then for the most industrialized economy on the continent that is actually still struggling to keep its economy afloat, don't you think that South Africa could be like a shining light in terms of staying in the trade? Because we have other African countries who also benefit from this particular trade, and this could dampen their spirits and, of course, result in a loss of revenue for them. So how do you think this would affect other African countries who are actually looking up to South Africa in this light, but then is faced with this particular sanction?
I mean, I think there would be a knock-on effect, right? Especially if countries are going to be taking an example from South Africa. As much as I would want to look at this from a trade perspective, I think one of the biggest things that we need to then solve for, I think that the decisions that need to be made are whether it's worth actually having AGOA as like a leverage thing, which the US can use at any given point if they want to. As I said earlier, this is not the first time that the US has threatened to kick South Africa out of AGOA or has made threats along the lines of removing us from AGOA. And so I think the powers that be then need to make a decision about whether being in AGOA and having this sort of carrot and stick situation is actually worth the benefits that we're reaping. And I mean, when you look at the numbers, yes, it is around 3% of our total exports, but at the end of the day, that is a big chunk of our revenue. I think when we're looking at the numbers from last year, it's around 60 billion rands, and that is a big chunk of money that not only supports export revenue, but there's an entire value chain that is supported in the country and also within the continent. And so what kind of example other countries decide to take from South Africa, I think it's up to them. I think it's necessary to evaluate the costs and the benefits of the program and see whether it's actually worth keeping up. But as I said, for South Africa, I think 60 billion rands is quite a lot of money. It supports industries, including employment, for example, just outside of the export revenue. And so those are the things that we need to think about from both a trade perspective, but also from a foreign policy perspective.
Well, that's true. Just about, as you said now, the 60 billion rand accumulates to about 54% of the total volume of trade of exports between South Africa and the US, looking at the AGOA trade. So that is a huge chunk of money being lost if South Africa is taken out of the list. But then I'd like to find out if the US government goes ahead to ratify this, that South Africa has an alternative market whereby it can export its products. Do you think that South Africa can exist, its export trade can exist outside of AGOA?
Sure. I mean, I think sometimes we oversell the idea of finding export markets somewhere else, right? And normally what we say is that we can improve trade within the region, but that has its costs and benefit as well. I think part of the problem within the region and actually creating a regional value chain that's able to trade, part of the problem is infrastructure. And so I think once infrastructure problems are sorted, it would be slightly easier to say South Africa can find an alternative market. The other place to go would then be Europe and Asia. But again, when you're going to Europe and also looking at the auto sector, you start bumping up against new legislation and policy coming up in relation to climate change. So, I mean, when you look at the volume of cars that we're exporting right now, they're mostly internal combustion engine vehicles, right? And when you look at the European Union now imposing the CBAM, which has to do with carbon emissions, I think it would be difficult for South Africa to then say they're going to shift auto exports to the European Union when we're bumping up against the fact that at some point in the coming years, the European Union is looking to ban exports or imports rather of internal combustion engine vehicles. In terms of the other goods, I mean, as much as they're not as carbon intensive, I think by virtue of there being carbon in the production processes, they're going to bump up against policies such as CBAM in the European Union. And it's not just the European Union that's looking to implement carbon-related legislation and policies. Other countries are doing it as well. And so I think when we talk about issues of finding other markets, I think we have to go back to, are we actually doing enough to decarbonize our own production processes so that we have access to these markets? Because as is, I think it would be difficult for South African exporters to actually enter into new markets. Yes, there is a long history of exporting autos into the European market, but I think there are limitations to that, which is why the American market is important for the industry. And so I think, as I said earlier, I mean, if we sort out the issues of infrastructure around the continent, we can then start talking about, is there a way to actually develop a market? Because, I mean, it is a continent with more than 1 billion people, so there's definitely a market there. I think there's just factors that are getting in the way of the development of that market.
All right, well, we know that the AGOA program deal will be expiring in the year 2025, and by then it will be reevaluated. The criteria and the quality for qualifying for that particular program will be reevaluated. So we get to see if South Africa will be able to retain its status at that particular point. But then we say thank you so much for joining us on the show. We appreciate your presence.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, you're welcome. So the South Africa's response to U.S. government's concerns will undoubtedly be crucial to either getting penalized or avoiding any negative impact on the country's economy and trade with the U.S. The AGOA deal expires in 2025, as I said earlier, and a new summit is scheduled to be hosted in South Africa in November. So what will be South Africa's decision as its import and export trade weighs on the balance? Will it have to dance to the tune of the West or stay with Russia, which is, of course, part of BRICS? So that is an unfolding situation or events that will continue to monitor to see what response South Africa will give as regards the AGOA trade deal. That is the end of Business Edge for today. Do not forget that you can visit our social media platforms at New Central TV, and that is the handle. You can also visit our website, www.newcentral.africa, and equally download our mobile app on App Store and Play Store. At the top of the hour, we'll be bringing you the news. My name is Lekan Onabanjo. Enjoy the rest of your day.